Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here with you all today, virtually, to discuss this super important and exciting issue that we're all tackling in education right now. And I think we've heard from all of the speakers who've been setting context how challenging the current situation is, and just how difficult it's been for students in terms of adjusting their learning approaches, adjusting their methods in terms of how they interact with teachers, how they interact with their parents who've become proxy teachers in many cases. And right now, in the middle of a second wave that we're experiencing here in Europe, my own children are not in school right now. Many students are still at home or are in hybrid learning scenarios where we see this mix of digital, mix of face-to-face, in some cases in limited classes, and also a huge variety in terms of what hybrid learning actually means. We see here in Europe, in places like Finland, where the usage of technology is deeply integrated into education in many ways, and access to technology is not an issue, and they've been doing a lot of live lessons. Meanwhile, in other countries, just like here in Belgium where I live, technology is still new for some teachers, particularly at primary level. And so it's been very much an asynchronous model, with students using traditional books and simply receiving assignments from teachers by email, maybe once or twice a week or every day, but with no direct face-to-face contact in a video or virtual experience for them. So what we mean by hybrid learning is extremely diverse. And what I would say from the Microsoft side, we've really seen that in terms of the usage of technology in learning, that there has been more change since the beginning of the COVID pandemic in terms of technology adoption in the classroom than there has been in the last 10 years. And this has put immense pressure on teachers in terms of evolving their pedagogy, immense pressure on school leaders in those systems where they have had to take individual technology decisions. I think in those centralized systems where there has been kind of air cover offered by ministries of education who've helped to make that selection for schools and enabled schools to focus on evolving the pedagogy, it has been somewhat easier, and some of the OECD research has borne that out. But we're still very much in a phase of learning, of experimentation, of improvement, of iterative approaches to how we actually do digital pedagogy in the world of hybrid learning. And we have to keep doing this. We have to keep moving and examining and reflecting on the approaches and the practices that we're implementing to make sure that they're really effective. So what we've seen when we work together with countries across the world, there are several key elements to the way that we think about digital inclusion in the post-COVID world. And the first is really actually having a strong hybrid and online learning strategy. We've seen some countries putting teachers really at the center of the process in terms of thinking about what does that digital pedagogy look like, how do they build it out, how do they create different types of learning scenarios despite being in an online world. And also a huge focus on the availability of devices. I think those countries that had strong social policy in place, that had connectivity and devices in the hands of families who are maybe socially excluded, found it easier to move towards hybrid learning than those countries that didn't. And we're seeing a huge scramble worldwide with the purchasing of devices reaching levels never seen before in education, because school systems everywhere are trying to make sure that students who don't have those devices available in the home actually have access to them. And at the same time, making sure that there is connectivity available for students. I think it's come as a big surprise, even for the most developed countries, just how poor connectivity is in terms of facilitating remote learning. So we've even heard about stories in the UK where parents were making the choice between buying additional data packages on their mobile phone or buying food for the household so that their children could carry on connecting with their learning. And then working in countries like Senegal, which I'll talk about later, obviously there's huge parts of the countries which just have no provision at all, whether it's through data or and telecom networks or through satellite connections. And so many governments are trying to really accelerate quickly those connectivity projects to make sure that we reach those really disadvantaged communities that are not able to connect. But to enable all of this to actually work, we need to make sure that we're leveraging our investments effectively, that we're choosing technologies that are laying the foundation for a sustainable future in terms of the usage of technology in schools, and having really good skilling and remote professional development strategies in place so that we can support educators in getting the skills that they need so that they can support their students. And at the same time, not neglecting parents' skills in that mix, because parents have become one of the gatekeepers of learning, particularly in a homeschooling scenarios. We have got a huge opportunity, though, that's been generated by the usage of more digital platforms in education. That is, we've got more data on the process of learning than we've ever had before. And this enables us to start to do some really interesting research on what type of behaviors result in learning gains. Through platforms like Teams, we can correlate how students are learning in terms of their activity and engagement with each other or with learning content versus the type of grades that they're getting in learning assignments. But all of this has to be underpinned by a really strong security and privacy strategy to ensure that we're actually making ethical and responsible use of all of this data that we're generating, and ethical and responsible use of the tools that we have. So this digital transformation is implying new ways of learning, new ways of teaching, and new ways of working as education systems. And we're seeing dramatic change in the way that systems think about how they integrate technology. We had an emergency pedagogy phase in March where pretty much all systems were just kind of throwing different approaches out there to see what would work. And then as the new back to school phase came here in Northern Europe, we saw new types of approaches evolving where schools had taken the school holidays as an opportunity to refine and improve their approaches. And it's become very much a conversation that now goes beyond the classroom. We're not thinking about what just happens in the classroom from a technology standpoint, but how can we optimize the infrastructure more broadly, whether it's the connectivity, whether it's the device provision, and make sure that learning is really possible beyond the classroom. And I think there's also been a dramatic change in the way that people understand what types of devices are effective for learning and what learning scenarios different devices are appropriate for. We've seen in the past many examples of school systems trying to pick essentially the cheapest possible device with the idea that if you go for something very low cost, you can give out a large number of them and lots of students benefit. But we've seen that can go really tragically wrong with, for instance, in cases like in South Africa, where we saw low-cost devices. Within 1 year, 50% of the devices purchased actually no longer working or being stolen because they didn't have appropriate security tools embedded in them. And so what I'm excited to see is that more and more ministries of education and schools are thinking thoughtfully about which device do I choose based on the developmental capabilities of my students. I want to pick something which is higher quality, which is resistant, that's going to be a more sustainable choice for my system and for my school, so that I can use it today with this year group, but I can also use it with other students in future. The same applies for the types of tools and technologies that we embed into the learning process. We've seen a lot of enterprise tools simply being moved into education and expecting them to work well in education scenarios. And unfortunately, that doesn't necessarily always bear out, particularly if we're thinking about primary or secondary students who need to have rich approaches that involve a lot of graphical, fun ways to interact with content which are more close to entertainment, that gamified learning approaches. And then as students grow, to get them closer to productivity tools that they're going to experience in the workplace, so that they're really prepared to use professional level productivity tools once they go into their job or they go into higher education. And in higher education scenarios, we're seeing a lot of really interesting adoption being made of tools which are professional level development tools, professional level IT tools that enable students to go out and to be the real builders and constructors of the technology solutions of tomorrow instead of being technology consumers. One of the things that we've focused on a great deal is how we can work together with the public sector as we've implemented remote and hybrid learning with our customers across the world. And UNESCO has been a key part of this. We were a founding member of the Global Coalition for COVID Response together with UNESCO. And so we've been working with ministries of education, particularly in low and middle income countries, to make sure that they have access to Office 365 as a free teaching and learning platform in perpetuity, that we offer dedicated training programs that have been built and tested for connectivity with low data access and with low-end device availability. So we've been testing out using Teams in offline scenarios, using Teams in scenarios where you can only connect, say, maybe once a day or once a week, so that we can synchronize and plan asynchronous learning scenarios, and building out rapid-fire training that can be easily given to large numbers of teachers in a short period of time. And we've seen amazing impact of this approach across the world, and we built it by being thoughtful, by being based on research, and created scenarios for teaching and learning that were based on the different levels of access to devices and curriculum and digital content. And based on these scenarios, we then developed what could be the pedagogical scenarios that the technology availability could enable, and used these to then build our professional development materials and our recommendations that we gave to governments as they thought about their remote and hybrid learning process. All of this is underpinned by the long-term research that we've been doing in education through the Education Transformation Framework, which is a roadmap and planning tool we've been offering to governments to help them think about how they transform the education system in their countries. And this roadmap is something that they can use both for today's remote and hybrid learning scenario needs, but also for thinking more long-term about where they want to get to in the future and envision what the new normal, without being bogged down by this kind of emergency pedagogy needs, could really look like. So, as I mentioned, we've been working closely with Senegal. We saw dramatic growth in the usage of technology in Senegal, thanks to this partnership together with UNESCO and ourselves, as well as other partners in the global coalition. And what's been really interesting is, since we implemented this, we've seen the growth in the usage of Teams as a teaching and learning platform in Senegal coming up to the same kind of level as much more developed economies within their geography. So even in a location like Senegal, where access is a challenge, where students are sharing one device in a home, they might be having just one smartphone among multiple siblings and a parent, even there we've seen that it's possible to use technology for a remote and hybrid learning strategy and see significant adoption within a country. I think one of the other key learnings that we've really taken away from the remote learning experiences has been how lonely it can be for students. One of our speakers mentioned earlier about the level of students failing to complete their education or dropping out of schooling. And much of this is because of the sense of isolation which comes in a remote or hybrid learning scenario. And so this is something that we really concentrated on from our education research and education engineering perspective, was to look at what kinds of interfaces enable a more rich and social learning experience. And so we built a new interface for Teams. This is the Teams Together mode, where you can envision the people that you're working and learning with in actually a traditional lecture hall space. And it can look kind of gimmicky, but what's really fascinating about the research that's been done is that the cognitive load of interacting with others within this type of space is significantly lower than in the typical everyone in the small Hollywood boxes, as they call it, kind of visualization that we have in many digital platforms. And as soon as you start to switch to this mode, you notice that the interaction between people in the space becomes much more natural, much more fluid, much more informal. People try to actually reach out and touch each other virtually. And so I think there's some really rich opportunities for us collectively to experiment with what kinds of affordances do technologies and technology interface choices give us in terms of the learning impacts that we can generate among students experiencing these types of platforms in their everyday learning lives. So we want to think about ways to make technology more sticky, to make it more rich, to make it more engaging for students. And we found that there's a lot of key issues that we have to build into the pedagogy to make the most of this type of learning. So switching between synchronous and asynchronous to break up the routine, to focus on having an agile and flexible mindset as much for teachers as for school leaders as for students. Thinking about having that strong skills strategy, leveraging the potential to bring in new voices from further outside of the community, because after all, we don't have to worry anymore if somebody can come to visit the classroom. We can connect with a scientist or a researcher in a research station in the North Pole if we want to. And fundamentally, to also not forget, we are in the middle of an emergency. Students, parents, teachers, we're all going through really difficult personal circumstances, and we need to be much more human and much more empathetic in teaching and learning in the digital world during the COVID crisis. All of this is challenging for teachers, so we haven't neglected teachers in making this happen. At Microsoft, we have invested a lot in teacher training to enable them to deploy effective remote and hybrid learning through creating self-training programs that teachers can access anytime they need and want, and also by using our network of 400 global training partners, which SoFIA is one of them, to ensure that training is out there in multiple languages for every single teacher who would need it when they need it to make remote and hybrid learning a really rich experience. So I think we've seen during the COVID period a really unprecedented willingness of public and private sector to come together to learn lessons quickly, to experiment quickly, and to try to understand what's going to be really the most effective way to ensure that learning doesn't stop despite the COVID pandemic. And we want that to continue so that we can really build back to a new normal, a new education system that is richer, more rewarding, and more inspiring for every single student. Thank you.